In the 1980s and early 1990s, our speaker's business took him all over the United States. A frequent visitor to Western Europe on business as a tourist, and once on a political fact-finding tour for the JBS, he was at the Berlin Wall when it was coming down. During this tour, he became acquainted with many businessmen, academics, and members of the German cabinet and European Union. He also served on his small-town city council as the chairman of his local chamber of commerce, and as an official and elector to the Republican Party, and as a local leader in the state of Washington for Christian Coalition. He also served as an officer in the Select Reserve Force of the Army and National Guard. He has held virtually every volunteer and staff position in the society, including National Director of Development and Communications and National Director of Field Activities. For several years, he represented the society in a variety of media events, including appearing on 60 Minutes, and was a short time on our Speakers Bureau. He resides in Wisconsin with his wife, Joanne. He's the CEO of the John Birch Society, who's recently is going to be publishing a new book soon, and I asked him to put a plug into it if he would, so you know what it's about. I'm proud to present you Mr. Arthur Thompson.
Thanks, Bill. Well, thank you for coming to this afternoon seminar. There'll be a break for dinner. That ought to give me enough time. Here are my notes. You know, I was quipping earlier that, you know, you put a 40-minute speech together and a year and a half later it's 2 hours. I'm going to skip some of these slides in the interest of time, but I want to point out one thing, by the way, on this fast track business. Congress authorizing the president to negotiate treaties. First of all, as you know, Congress has to regulate commerce. Congress. That means both the House and the Senate. That's why both the House and the Senate vote on these trade agreements. They are treated as treaties. They are, the practice is to implement them as treaties, but they don't call them treaties because the House votes on them. But at any rate, there's a reason for that, and I won't get into it. But just to point out something out on this fast track, so you get to understand it. The President of the United States is already in charge of the negotiations on these treaties. It's illegal. Without fast track authority, it's illegal. And yet that's what they're doing, and they will stamp their approval on it afterward. It's the old thing that you run into in business once in a while, that it's easier to get forgiveness than it is permission. And that's the way Obama operates. It's easier to get forgiveness than it is permission. So he operates outside of the Constitution. Now, I'm going to try and produce a paradigm shift for you today. All of you are familiar with the various things that we had as kids, showing a forest or a jungle, and it says, now find the lion and the tiger and the bear, and you can't find it, and you look around, and finally you see, well, that kind of looks like an eye, and yeah, that's a nose, and yeah, that's an ear, and suddenly the head becomes obvious, and gee whiz, before you know it, you see the whole giraffe. But it takes that change in your mind, you see, because your eyes are telling you, I'm seeing a jungle. So your mind has to say, wait a minute, I know that there's something in there, I've got to find it, and lo and behold, you find it. And then you find another and another and another, and every time you go back, you see them right away. Well, these things show up in a lot of things. Here's out of a Disney comic book, and they want you to find the notorious outlaws who've disappeared. Well, if you turn it upside down, there they are. See that one here and here and here in the foliage. You know, just a nice little thing for kids. So what I'm trying to do is to get you to see that sometimes you don't really notice what's going on. It might be right in front of your eyes, but you don't see it. Here's some examples, for instance, of how to take what we call photoshopping today and show how it's been done in the past. Here, for instance, is a picture of Abraham Lincoln that's in many, many school texts. But it's not Abraham Lincoln, it's only his head. It's actually John Calhoun. They took a picture of John Calhoun, who was more statuesque, because Lincoln wasn't, and they put his head on top of Calhoun. Here's another with Grant. This is actually 3 different photographs. The background, the horse and figure, and the head is the only thing in there that's Grant. And it's the same way with Mussolini. They airbrushed out the handler of the horse. See, because here's Mussolini on the back of a horse brandishing his sword. He didn't want that horse to rear on him, so they had a guy holding the horse down. But before they published it, they airbrushed him out. You see, so there are all sorts of things like that over history, and things that we know because we see them, but are not necessarily published in the American press. Here, for instance, is the African Communist magazine of the South African Communist Party's. It's their organ, and it shows Mandela there in front of the hammer and sickle up on the banner, and we have several photographs like that. We've even seen photographs where they've airbrushed the hammer and sickle out before they published the photograph in the American newspapers. And when he died, by the way, the Central Committee of the Communist Party admitted that, yeah, he was on the Central Committee all the while he was the head of the South African government. So a lot of times it will be actually hidden from you. I won't dwell on this one. Here's another one. For instance, these are 5 different settings, supposedly all independent of one another, simulcasted on television, so on each 5 different television networks, so that you didn't know that it wasn't an exclusive interview with Obama. See, here's ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, and this is Univision for the Spanish language television. And see, they're all the same thing, the same day. They just bring in their commentator, and then they bring in the next one, the next one, the next one, and then on Sunday they're all broadcast simultaneously. But do you think it's an exclusive interview with Obama by each one of these individuals? Here's one that I really like. This is April 1996. See, a lot of times, a lot of journalists will go to Moscow, and what happens is they let themselves over to the propaganda ministry in Moscow, and they don't wine and dine them, they vodka and dine them. And so they're always in this kind of a haze, and when it's all over, they haven't got anything to show for it, so they hand them a packet. That's how it's done. So they take those photographs and even the articles and put them into their parent organ as if it was their work. Here, for instance, is something interesting, because you'll see in April 1996, on Lenin's birthday, is this gal. Here she is in 2009, again in 2010, and April 12 for Stalin's or Lenin's birthday. And out of tens of thousands of people who are marching in Red Square, she's the only one who gets photographed, because she is actually photographed by the propaganda ministry, and then it's handed to the journalists, you see, and then it's printed in the Western press. So here, and she's, I've got her again this year, but I haven't put it up on this presentation. But this shows you the reality of the propaganda. Now, it all began really with John Brown. John Brown was a communist, okay? He was a communist. They invented a new system they called terrorism. Now, if you go back to the old dictionaries and the old encyclopedia and everything else, you'll discover that terrorism was a state-sponsored activity to subjugate the people. It was state-sponsored. It was done by government. This is the first time that it wasn't done by government. It was invented by American conspirators in the United States. And these individuals, Kaji, Hinton, and Redpath, were newspaper reporters. And they committed murder and mayhem with John Brown and sent back reports to the New York Tribune, the New York Herald, the Chicago Tribune, the St. Louis Dispatch, et cetera, as if they were non-biased reporters. But they were in on it. Have you ever wondered, ladies and gentlemen, why it is that the governments of these foreign countries can't seem to find the terrorists, but the journalists can? because the journalists are with them. I could expound on that, but we'll leave it at that. And so you see all sorts of things in the press to convince you that this is terrorism. It's all independent. There's no coordination to it at all. You might have some coordination in a certain geographical area, but not worldwide. But it is a worldwide coordination. Now, the purpose is to change the people in government or to change the government's policies and their system. Usually you will not find terrorism being used until the government in that country has already been subverted enough to stand still for the pressure. In other words, most people, if they've got a solid government with a free people, terrorism won't work, okay? Terrorism only really works when there's enough people in government to say, oh, we've got to do something. And take the reaction of the people to terrorism and bring about more draconian government. That's the whole purpose of it, is to bring about more draconian government. Hitler used it with the Reichstag Fire, didn't he? See, they lit the fire in the Reichstag, and then in the name of this terrorism, they imposed a totalitarian government. And it was the same under Stalin. Stalin, a lot of people don't know that Stalin had a war on terror. And that's what it was called. And he had the Chetka go out and kill a few people, pretend they were terrorists, and then as a result, he was able to arrest all of his opponents inside the Communist Party and call them terrorists and execute them. So he did that over about a decade. Now, if you go back, for instance, the second line, the New Webster 1912 dictionary, terrorist is one who governs by terror. One who governs by terror. Another one in 1995, a systematic use of violence, terror, and intimidation to achieve an end. Well, there you see is a gradual change in the definition over a period of time. If you want a real interesting example of changing the definition of a word in order to manipulate through semantics the population, go back to 1900 and see how many old dictionaries you can get and look up the word inflation. Because I stopped in the middle of it. I started with 1910, and every 10 years, in 1920, 1930, et cetera, I would go into classes and I would give talks on how the definition of words change. And I would show the gradual change from the fact that inflation was the use of the government of the printing press to print money without being backed by gold or silver. That's the original definition in the dictionaries. But gradually now, the dictionaries are now saying it is a rise in wages and prices. And that's the result of inflation. That's not inflation itself. And so you can show people how they change the semantics. Democracy, a lot of these words have changed over the years as to what they really meant. Now, we had the 1911 terrorist attack, and that was done to create a reaction in the American people. Now, how do we know that? Besides the fact that that is the standard technique. Because Osama bin Laden told us on CNN. He said that the battle has moved to inside America. I tell you, freedom and human rights in America are doomed. The U.S. government will lead the American people and the West in general into an unbearable hell and choking life. He said that 2 days after the attack. Because he knew, and that's why the attack was done, that the American people would demand law and order. Well, we got a lot of it. We experience it every time we get on a plane. They even stop us on the street and inspect our cars, all in the name of Friday and Saturday night drunkenness and that kind of thing. Check your brakes. How many of you ever been stopped to check your brakes? They do that in LA. They will go into areas and set up temporary stops, and everybody goes through that neighborhood has to stop and have their brakes examined. So increasingly, they are stifling us with these regulations, particularly on the freedom of movement and that sort of thing. Now, here's Osama bin Laden. His second in command is al-Zawahiri. Al-Zawahiri today is the head of Al-Qaeda. He's the head of the whole shebang. The interesting thing about al-Zawahiri is he's a Russian-trained asset. He was trained by the Russians, and the FSB handles him. Now, we know that because of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Litvinenko, because he exposed the fact that al-Zawahiri was one of their guys when he defected. And for that, they rewarded Alexander with that radioactive tea. Remember that case? Where he died a slow, excruciating death because of his revelations about some of the things that they were doing in the name of terrorism. He exposed the fact, for instance, that Putin sent in Russian troops in order to bomb apartment houses and that sort of thing, even in Moscow, and do it in the name of Chechen terrorism. So then that gave them the excuse to invade Chechnya and take it over again, you see. So that's how these things are done. At any rate, see, the thing is that this is something that a lot of people don't get. All this conflict in this area, what's right across the border? We don't seem to remember this. It's right next to Russia, isn't it? So don't you think that they might have a little bit of concern relative to what goes on along their border? But that's never pointed out in the press, is it? You know, they used to call it the Great Game. How many read Kim by Rudyard Kipling? They called it the Great Game between the British Foreign Service intelligence apparatus and the Russian intelligence apparatus for ascendancy in all of these countries along there, particularly Afghanistan, you see. And so that's never eased up, but we don't think about that. All of these countries here, for instance, are all Muslims, and they are inside Russia. Now, this is speculation. It's purely speculation. But I believe that some of these people in ISIS are actually from those regions because they're too well trained. These are not terrorists, ladies and gentlemen. They're very well organized and very well trained. And it's obvious that they have experience. However, some of that experience and that training was done in Jordan. Now, guess who were the trainees? United States forces. You see, all of this you can look up in line. Now, if you don't believe me, write it down, go home, go on the web, and start looking some of this up. You will find that we trained ISIS. They say it is a branch now of Al-Qaeda, which they have hidden. They called it a branch of Al-Qaeda. Now they don't like to say that anymore. And they say it grew up in Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, when we invaded Iraq, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. None. But they were able to recruit as a result of our invasion. And then it grew, and it grew, and it grew. So the interest is right there. It's on the border of Russia. By the way, you remember, this is how they hide it, by the way. They create deniability by the way that they do things. Now, here is the attempted assassination on John Paul II. Now, the interesting thing is that this benevolent individual, who is just trying to save the earth now through the environmental movement, was one of 10 Russian leaders that signed an order to have the Pope killed. And the way they did it was simply, they had who was the guy that pulled the trigger? He was a Muslim, wasn't he? He belonged to a Turkish terrorist group, right? Well, if they had assassinated him before he was caught by his own people, or if they'd killed him in the process of arresting him, they never would have found out he was taking his orders from Bulgaria, who was operating under the KGB. You see? So the order was given in Moscow through the KGB to Bulgaria to this Turkish terrorist group, and then they carried it out in Rome. See, a level of deniability, any link in that chain had been broken, then they would never have known who really gave the order. You see, and so they do that. They will do it with Cuba. They do it with Iran. They will do it with all sorts of countries that they control to create a layer of deniability so it doesn't lead directly to Moscow. It's still going on today. Brezhnev, to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1981 said, "A liberation struggle can be waged under the banner of Islam." Huge clue, ladies and gentlemen, as to what's going on today. And if you go back and you research the Muslim Brotherhood, you'll find such things as this in the New York Times back in October 1904. And this is a quote. As Fadi Qanan, one of Qutb's disciples, wrote in the 1960s, quote, "The groundwork for the French Revolution was laid by Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. The Communist Revolution realized plans set by Marx, Engels, and Lenin. The same holds true for us as well." You notice the Quran isn't mentioned? Voltaire and Marx are mentioned. And if you research the Brotherhood, you will find out that it is Marxist. It is not Muslim. At the top, it's Marxist. You may have fanatical Muslims at the bottom, but that's show business. The conspiracy will always take on the trappings of the local religion, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever it is. But at the top, they are irreligious, they're anti-God. It has nothing to do with any of those religions whatsoever. And study the history of the assassins. That will tell you an awful lot. It was at the bottom, they were fanatical Muslims. At the top, they didn't believe in the Quran or anything else. It was all about power. And they laughed at these fanatics at the bottom. How many have noticed that the leaders of these terrorist groups don't strap dynamite onto themselves? You know? And so they can, and it's very interesting. I'm not going to dwell on the assassins, but look the assassins up. It's really quite a story. At any rate. Here, another thing is that it isn't just Muslim. You see, these are Christians. These are Christians in South Africa marching under the banner of communism, selling communism as Christians. You see, we think it's all a Muslim problem. Just keep your eye on the Muslims. Don't pay any attention to the pastor down the street who's leading his parish into communism. It's all focusing us on one thing. We had a lot of riots in the 60s. You all remember, not all of you, some are younger. But, we had a real problem. It was not a matter of an occasional bomb. It was a bombe du jour, wasn't it? It was constant. I infiltrated Marxist organizations in the 60s in tandem with the Seattle Police Intelligence Squad. And we were able to shut down a lot of these riots and things before they got started. A riot is not a spontaneous, unorganized thing. It's made to look like it. It is always organized. There is no riot, there's no rally, there's no gathering of a bunch of people in the town square that is not organized, ladies and gentlemen. It's not Twitter, it's not Facebook, it's not email. Somebody had to decide on the hour and the day and the place to meet, did they not? Pretty simple, isn't it? But it's sold to us as spontaneity, and it's not. And so these sorts of things were being done by communists, like H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael, burn baby burn. Well, they, after the so-called fall of communism, they changed overnight. You see, a lot of communist leaders around the world did. They suddenly became something else the day after the death knell of communism. Well, he became an imam. H. Rap Brown, this is him. Stokely Carmichael became an imam, you see. And if they weren't of an ethnic background where they could become a Muslim, they still wrote about it. Here's Carlos the Jackal out of France, one of the most notorious communist terrorists of the 60s and early 70s. He now writes books on terrorism for the Muslims. And I guess I don't have a picture of his wife. His wife is a famous communist lawyer in France, and she meets with him in jail once in a while to stay overnight. That's a courtesy of the French government. And so this is the kind of thing that's been going on. So now, if you're not paying attention or you're not old enough and that sort of thing to recognize what's been going on, that's what's been going on. I even knew of a guy that J. Edgar Hoover called the most dangerous terrorist in the United States, in Seattle. And we were able to kind of break that thing up because they were stockpiling weapons and explosives and everything else. And I won't tell you the whole story, but I will say that he became a rabbi. And so he called us up one day and says, hey, you know, we don't agree on everything, but golly, we do agree on some things. I'd like to write for your magazine on those some things. And the guy came in to see me in my office. He says, have you ever heard of so-and-so? And I said, Rabbi, he said, no, I don't. But I remembered the guy, you know, the name. And let's go online, see if it's the same guy. It was. See, he wanted to come in and start to try and infiltrate us. Okay, I'll do a little articles. Then I'll become an expert on a particular genre. And I'll be happy to go out and give some talks for you. That way he meets our local leadership and that sort of thing. And then it's just one after another. And that's the way these guys work.
How did y'all shut him down?
Huh?
Did you interview him? Or?
No. I wanted to, but
Just for fun.
just for fun, yeah. But I had enough fun in those days, so I didn't need any more. I remember we had 5 bookstores in Seattle at one time, the John Birch Society. And the big one was downtown. And Mrs. Crow walks in. Well, I knew Mrs. Crow. And she's looking around, and I said, hello, Mrs. Crow, how are you? And her face got white, see, because she was a leader in the Communist Party. So I said, yeah, I know who you are. Just take your time, look around. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them for you. I let her browse around, and so you know what she said when she went back. They know who we are, you know. I went in there, they knew who I was immediately, you know. The paranoia, wonderful. Yasser Arafat got his start in the Muslim Brotherhood, as did Osama bin Laden. This is Yasser Arafat's KGB handler. Never went anywhere without him. Yasser Arafat worked for the KGB. It wasn't Muslim, okay? Here's Muslims, Hamas, and all these weapons, guess where they come from? It's a clue. No, Russia and China. Now, we see this a lot, don't we? I even see this at the airport. I had a woman have to take my ID to get on the plane a couple of years ago wearing this one right here. TSA blue. And I could dwell on that, but that's good enough. And so we find ourselves being manipulated and controlled now because of the 9/11 attack. That was the whole purpose behind this thing, was to get us to stand still for anything in the name of the war on terror. We got to win the war. So tax me. So search my car, search my wallet, do everything you would need to win the war on terror. Now, at the airports and other places of transportation, they violate the First Amendment, they violate the Fourth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment. And yet they took the oath to abide by the Constitution, did they not? Now, I will say this. Most TSA people I know are patriots. They honestly believe that what they are doing is in the best interest of the United States. But I don't include the ones that work in Chicago, okay? I mean, you know, when you're going through in this heavy set, and that's putting it mildly, woman in a TSA uniform who shaves her head every day, and wears big spangle earrings, you kind of got an idea that maybe she's got a little bit different agenda than most folks. But the local regional airports and that kind of thing, they're good, fine local citizens. They just don't get it. So they do this, you know the whole thing. Here's Janet Napolitano when they first started this. She says, "We will always live in a terrorist threat environment." Always live. Does that sound like they're going to win? Terrorism's something that we just have to be prepared to live with. Well, get used to it. We need to do all we can to mitigate the risk, but that means individuals undergo a certain amount of inconvenience at times. Now, this is, I hate to tell you this. I didn't change the slide on this yet. I got a new slide made this week. But now you can extend this out to here and include in there the Civil War and the Spanish-American War together. All those wars together equals the War on Terror in time. That's the amount of time that we've been involved in the War on Terror. Benjamin Franklin said it so nicely. He said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty or safety." Here's Sandra J. O'Connor. And this is where it starts getting real scary, because she said when she was on the court, "I suspect that over time we will rely increasingly on international and foreign courts in examining domestic issues." Ladies and gentlemen, those are involved in those free trade treaties. They are locking us into international courts. We had a big fight over staying away from the international court. You have no idea how many other international courts exist that are involved in controlling us in this country and from which there is no appeal. They supersede any state or the Supreme Court. It's getting pretty bad. As a matter of fact, most of you know that it isn't the law that's passed. It's the regulations that are formulated after the law. Now, it may even be completely contrary to what the law says, but that's how they enforce it. Now, Obamacare in the printed form, the final printed form, is that thick. The regulations for Obamacare is a stack this high, 7 feet 6 inches. Regulations of how to implement this. And what may be in there, you could echo Pelosi again. And this time we're not going to pass it, but we're going to implement it to find out what's in it. Now, the thing is that I just got in my hands, I don't have it with me because it's a different presentation, the guidelines to implement CETA, the Canadian-European Trade Agreement. And in there, they talk about affirming, in the how to implement this thing, affirming the United Nations Universal Human Rights Initiative, which states that everything has to be done under the principles and beliefs of the United Nations. Well, that's not in the treaty, but that's how they're going to implement it, you see. And that's a presentation that I like to give on just how they're changing the jurisprudence system in this country through treaties. We find an awful lot of people using this word, the New World Order. Kissinger just came out with a new book. What was it called? Anybody remember? Huh? World Order. And he reaffirms that we need a new world order. The first time I can find that it was used by Marx and Engels, now it was used by the conspiracy that predated the communists. There's a direct line from that conspiracy into communism, and in my new book I'll be showing that in great detail. But the first time I can find that they used it was 3 years before they published the Communist Manifesto, February of 1845, in the Holy Family. They said the revolutionary movement, which began in 1789 in the Cercle Social, gave rise to the communist idea of the New World Order. The communist idea of the New World Order. okay? They've obfuscated over the years that it is a communist idea, but it is the communist idea. Now, for those of you who want to spend hours in front of your computer, I recommend that you look up Cercle Social and follow the trail into the individuals who were part of that organization in Paris and how that had influence on the early history of the United States. You will be shocked. And yet you've never heard of this outfit, have you? It's one of the most important organizations that have ever existed in modern history. And I had never heard of it until I started looking into the Illuminati and its antecedents and everything else. And this is all in my book too, that's going to be out next year. Gorbachev urged the New World Order, and he visited Reagan at his ranch and urged that we call for a U.S. as partner. He wanted us as a partner to work toward the goal of a New World Order. Castro demanded it in front of the UN. He demanded a New World Order. Brown in New Zealand, in the New Zealand Herald newspaper, he was involved in secret talks to bring about a New World Order without involving the British citizens. Biden, how many here, you've all heard people say they want to impeach Obama, right? Comes and goes. I always answer, you like Biden better. Well, back in Wall Street Journal in April 23, 1992, Biden wrote how I learned to love the New World Order. Then he went to the Senate floor and gave a series of speeches on the New World Order, basically abrogating the Constitution and advocating us giving up our government into a global government. And he was so proud of himself, he put it out in a booklet called On the Threshold of a New World Order. And I've got this in my library. This guy's been involved in this. When Obama was not much more than an organizer of street thugs, he was a pretty important individual. Even the Chinese got into it a couple of days after the 9/11 deal. And they let everybody know in a backhanded way what this war on terror was all about. In the China Daily, they said, this makes it more urgent that the international community move to wage all-out war on terrorism by, in the final analysis, establishing a new world order that can ensure lasting peace. 3 days after 9/11. That really tells us what it's all about in a very short sentence. So, this man took the advice of Gorbachev a year later and made the strategy of the national strategy of the United States in August 1991 of a new world order. And this has been the official policy of the United States State Department ever since this was published, signed by Bush. I got this in my library too. He didn't announce it to the people, but if you want an exercise in this, go to YouTube. Type in George Bush New World Order. You will be inundated with videos of him giving speeches before the Congress, before the people on television, around in various professional organizations, etc., advocating a new world order under the UN. In fact, if you remember, that's why he said we were invading Iraq in the first Iraq War, was to establish a new world order and strengthen the UN. And so we see these two gentlemen get along very well. And it's interesting because Putin established a terrorist, anti-terrorist organization with his partners, the Americans. How many, by the way, remember the Snowden affair? Remember when he was in that room and he wasn't on Russian soil at the Moscow airport? And Putin said, I don't want to do anything that's going to upset my American partners? And people, huh? What does he mean by that? Literally, a lot of people don't know that H.W. Bush, Clinton, and W. Bush signed an agreement with the Russians to be partners and economically integrate our two countries. Go online, you can look it up. We are formally partners with Russia under those three agreements. The first one affirmed the second and reaffirmed on the third. Anyway, he names this anti-terrorist coordinating group between Russia and the United States, and he names these two guys as the co-chairman. Kissinger will head up the American wing, and Primakov will head up the Russian wing. Now, here you've got a guy who openly says, we need a new world order. And who is this guy? He's the former head of the KGB. Just before he had that job, he was in charge of running the terrorist training camps in the Muslim world for the KGB. So I guess he knows a little bit more about terrorism and can serve in that position. But that's the kind of thing that goes on. If you don't know the personalities, and this is what's always got the John Birch Society in trouble, we don't just expose the plan, which is bad enough. Most people talk the issue. Nobody talks the plan because they don't have a clue what the plan is. But in addition to that, we name names. These are the people responsible. This is their background. This is how they're doing it. Wake up. Gets us into trouble. China Daily, July 4, 2005. China and Russia issued a joint communique yesterday standing shoulder to shoulder on terrorism, hailing the role of the China-Russia strategic partnership in the establishment of a new world order. They are determined to work with other countries for global harmony. Here's a picture of KGB personnel working with CIA personnel. How many here know that the FBI has an office in Moscow? How many here know they have an office in Kiev? How many know that they have access to just about everything they want to have access to? They're partners, after all. This is stuff that you can find just by reading your newspaper. Really. But you have to pay attention and retain it. And remember it 6 months later when some other fact comes up and you say, uh-oh, now I understand why they did this there and whatever. Here we are. FBI will open an office in Ukraine. Here we are. FBI plans new office in Russia, in Moscow, back in 94, 96. Here's from this joint declaration, by the way, of a new relationship between the United States and Russia, May 24, 2002, signed by Bush and Putin. We are achieving a new strategic partnership. An era in which the United States and Russia saw each as an enemy or strategic threat has ended. We are partners, and we will cooperate to advance stability, security, and economic integration, and to jointly counter global challenges and to help resolve regional conflicts. Ladies and gentlemen, go online, look up Lockheed, Boeing, General Electric, General Motors, et cetera, and see the R&D and production that these companies have now in Russia and China, to the extent that today, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot put a major aircraft in the air without parts from Russia and China. Cannot do it, particularly out of titanium. How does that figure in defense? You see, we can't even put a man in space anymore any longer without cooperating with China and Russia using Russian engines. We don't even make rocket engines anymore. Lockheed's just signed an agreement with the EU that they're going to work together in joint spacecraft, and they did it with China as well. Now, of course, the Chinese would never learn any of our secrets as a result of that economic integration. Okay, Pakistan's our ally. They're also an ally of China. They buy their fighter craft from there. They're building dams there. They're building ports there. In May 2011, Pakistan's new prime minister said that China and Pakistan are like one nation and two countries. He compares Pakistan's Islamic socialism to the thoughts of Mao Zedong. The parties in I don't even want to get started on this, but the parties in control in Pakistan and India had its roots in the United States, in spiritualism. You can go online and look up the India Congress Indian National Congress. Look at it. It's antecedents. Who started, who actually was the head of it for years? It was Annie Besant, for those of you who understand that name. Look it up. You can't make these things up, ladies and gentlemen. If you look at it, you find some very funny things going on in all of this. Now, anyway, this just letting you know that they knew about these bombers before they happened in Boston, et cetera. But let's just keep going here because I want to show you something else. We are seeing U.S. and Russian cooperation in many, many ways. For instance, they're learning our capabilities in operation. They're gaining trust with minor revelations in the area of terrorism so that they can find out more from us about what we know. But at any rate, it's getting to the point now, do you know that Russian planes fly over the United States, over our military bases? How many here are private pilots? Can you fly over a U.S. military installation? No.
Not without permission, but you
Yeah, exactly. If you do, they force you down, you go to jail or fined, get your license taken away. The Russians do it to find, and it's a mutual agreement between Russia and the United States for them to fly over our bases to find out what we're doing. Make sure we're not going to attack them. We do it by satellite. We also, that's called the Open Skies Agreement. You can look it up. We've also been working with Spetsnaz and U.S. Special Forces training at Fort Carson, working together in our military so that they find out how our special forces operate. Vigilant Eagle, that's where Russians came into the NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs, Colorado, to watch one of our exercises and actually join in with it. We also have them with FEMA and the Russian Emergency Ministry swapping security for mass events and things of that nature there and here. You don't see them yet. And they agreed, the FBI and the SFB, to join forces to fight terrorism in 2004. How many here know that the Chinese Navy were out on exercises with the U.S. Navy this summer in the Pacific? Yeah. They're not going to learn much about us doing that, are they? You know, I mean, this is crazy stuff. It's literally treason in front of our eyes. And this says it all in the Investment Daily. It says terrorists' real foe is liberty, and that's the way it is. You can see all the surveillance now and everything. In Boston, they went house to house. They shut off all the power. They shut off all the phones, went house to house, and you didn't have anything to say about it. And if they had not done it, they would have found the terrorist in that boat earlier. You know, because the guy was not allowed to leave his house to find him for 2 or 3 days. Mr. Welch, the founder of the society, said terrorism is now the most dangerous and important facet of the insider's comprehensive design for enslaving the whole human race. He said that in the 70s. And so they train all these, they train the mentally deficient, and they create these incidences, and they train up the kids to do things in the name of Islam when it isn't Islam at all, ladies and gentlemen. And I get really irritated with a lot of Christian leaders that say Islam, 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 Islam. And they don't have a clue. They've never studied it. At any rate, there's some. This is Lieutenant General Ian Mahai Pachepa. He's the writer of a book called Disinformation. He defected to the West. My past experience at the top of the Soviet bloc intelligence community gives me solid ground to state that the Muslim attacks on U.S. embassies and the assassination of our ambassador to Libya, carried out with Soviet-made rocket-propelled grenades, Kalashnikovs, and Molotov cocktails, were just as spontaneous as the May Day parades in Moscow, and that they have the same organizers. Before I left Romania for good in 1978, my Romanian espionage service alone, his alone, had sent some 500 underground agents into various Islamic countries. Most of them were religious servants, engineers, medical doctors, teachers, and art instructors. According to a rough estimate received from Moscow by 1978, the whole Soviet bloc intelligence community had sent about 4,000 such agents of influence into the Islamic world. That was by 1978. How many tens of thousands since? Now, why all these various things? Because if you read Marx, he never talks about revolution per se. What he talks about is social revolution. The governments are reflective of their society. You have to change society in order to permanently change the government. Because if you don't, that people will come back and have a counter-revolution and throw the rascals out. So you have to change society. Now, I'm going to wrap this up because of the time factor, but I want to show you one thing. It's right in front of your eyes. Kurds push to take key dam. This was in the Wall Street Journal back in August. I dropped this stuff down here, so I hope I can find this right away. Here it is. This is last Friday, just last Friday's Wall Street Journal, right on the front page. If you know what you're looking at, if you've had that paradigm shift, then you read the article a lot differently than the average person. And it points out in here that this town, right along the border, Kobani, you've read about it, you've seen about it on the news, these poor Kurds. Well, the Kurds that hold Kobani are the Kurdish Workers' Party. Up until 7 years ago, their flag had the hammer and sickle on it. Okay, that's a clue. So Turkey isn't too enthusiastic about saving those Kurds. See? Because they know that the United States is going to take care of ISIS, so they don't care if ISIS wipes out one of their enemies first, you see. And also, we've already stated that we're going to be arming the Kurdish Workers' Party and the Kurdish Democrat Party. By the way, both of those parties were started by Russia. Go online, look them up. And the Peshmerga, there's three heavy factions. 2 out of the 3 were started by Russia. The Kurdish Workers' Party and the Kurdish Democrat Party. But we're going to be arming those people to the teeth. So ISIS may be our friend by the time we get done. Who knows? I mean, you know, it keeps revolving, doesn't it? It's just musical chairs as to what terrorist group is the enemy and the friend today and tomorrow and the next day. It's really ridiculous until you understand what is really going on. I would recommend another thing too on this war on terror. How many here watch my videos every week? Okay, now there's a way of getting to those videos. If you go to the jbs.org and scroll all the way to the bottom of the home page, it will say Facebook, okay? No, YouTube. Hit YouTube. That takes you to all the videos that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years every week. Go back, you can go back, you don't have to dwell on them, it's a pretty rapid process. Go back to the one where I'm holding a whiteboard. And on that whiteboard, I diagram how McCain brought about was one of the key people that brought about the coup, not the coup, but the change in Egypt that got rid of Mubarak and put in the Muslim Brotherhood. And then, when the coup came by the military, McCain ran over there with his Charlie McCarthy. You know him as Lindsey Graham. They went over to Egypt together and demanded, after the coup, a restoration of democracy. You threw out the legitimate voted government. We need that democracy restored. Now, he never ever said the word Muslim Brotherhood, but that's what he was advocating, you see. But there's 3 organizations that are very interesting to look at that are very heavily involved in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and in Crimea and other areas, financed by the State Department, under CFR leadership. And McCain is the head of one of these things. Another one where you can rest easy, and I'll call this to a halt, maybe take some questions or something. The day Hagel, the Republican senator, was named our Secretary of Defense by Obama, he was the chairman of the Atlantic Council. The goal of the Atlantic Council is the merger of the United States with the European Union as one country. So you can rest easy now that he's in charge of our defense. I spent Saturday night with a congressman, pretty good guy, and he was lamenting to me that they couldn't get anything past the Republican leadership in Congress, in the House. And I said, you know, have you ever looked at what your leadership is involved in outside of Congress? What organizations they belong to, what interests they have? He said, no. You know, and as sort of, why would I? I said, well, why don't you go to the Transatlantic Policy Committee and notice that their goal is to merge the United States and the EU by 2015, and the fact that Boehner is one of the guys working with them. See, we tend to trust a guy because he's got an R behind his name. But these people leave no stone unturned, you see. It makes no sense for them to have a united front over here and leave their enemies alone. They've got to infiltrate their enemies to neutralize them, you see. And so that's what they do. At any rate, I'll call a halt to this. We've been reporting on this, ladies and gentlemen, this war on terror. It's a phony war. It's phony. It's to manipulate the American people into agreeing to something they wouldn't normally agree to under any other conditions. Now, I've written a booklet called Inside the Terror Triangle, and a DVD. I guess we've got a few out there. John Adams, you know, I love quoting this guy. I can't make up my mind whether he was the best president or whether Washington was the best president, because this guy was phenomenal. But a constitution of government once changed from freedom can never be restored. Liberty once lost is lost forever. And that's the danger that we see today all around. It's not just in the war on the terror, but war on drugs, war on poverty. Now we got a war on Ebola. I hope they're successful with that one. These things are done and operated in such a manner not to win, but to manipulate the American people into standing still for things, again, that they would not normally stand still for. So go to this website. There's a lot more information on terrorism that you'll find very interesting, I believe. There was one question way in the back. Yes, sir.
My name is John Carnes. I work with Regina's Activists for Truth. We had James and Joanne Moriarty coming in to talk to our group. They had been in Libya during the time when the U.S. and NATO bombed and destroyed an infrastructure of Libya.
Yeah.
One of the things that they are still, James and Joanne Moriarty are still back in contact with the tribes of Libya. They have let it be known that there's
Yeah, I know who they are.
200 to 300 jihadis coming in from the Muslim Brotherhood controlled Libya to the United States per month, 200 to 300 per month. So that's I thought would be relevant to.
Well, yeah, if you're looking at that one thing. But I can tell you that they've been infiltrating people into the United States for 2 decades. For instance, if you go along the border, you will find emergency way stations on the border. In the arid areas, which most of them are, they have a 5-gallon container of water, and they have a sign above the telephone where you can phone the American authorities for help. That sign is in 3 languages: English, Spanish, Chinese. What does that tell you? You don't hear about it here, but in the Northwest we did, of the infiltration of Chinese into the country. It is a serious problem. I have on my desk over the last 3 years photographs of major weaponry being infiltrated across the southern border from 50 cal automatic all the way down, company strength in size of the material. Nobody can seem to find out where it's going. Now, if the numbers that have been interdicted are the same percentage of the numbers of drugs that have been interdicted, how much has been coming through? And we don't know for sure where it's going. But it's been going on, this has been going on for a number of years, ladies and gentlemen. And if you, and our own, I give a talk on immigration, and I get into a lot of this in that, but let me tell you what is happening to our communities is happening as a result of the policies of the federal government to change our societies. Where I come from now, where I live now, 15 years ago, you could not find an individual who was not of, generally speaking, Polish and German ancestry. You can't leave your house for 1 minute now in my community because of the last 15 years of finding individuals that are from all over the world. The government has flown in these refugees. Every time there's a problem, they fly in plane loads of refugees, and I want to thank you for that because you've been paying for it. And they go on subsidy. In my immigration talk, I actually show where that is the policy of the United States. For 7 years, when they first get here, all they have to do is perform community service in order to be subsidized 100% and live in better places than many of us can live. And that community service, well, can you spell acorn? That kind of thing. They are changing the societies of our country by this mass immigration. They flew in 10,000 Hmong into the Appleton area in a population of 150,000 in the general area. Do you know what that does to a community? How about all these Somalis they've been flying in? Now they're going to be flying in more Iraqis. They're going to be flying in Kurds. They're going to be flying in wherever the next place is. And it is changing America. These people, I don't care what religion they are, I don't care what color they are, they do not understand American liberty, the Constitution, the Declaration, all these things. They don't understand it, and that is the danger to us. It's not whether they eat curry or whether they eat salsa or anything else. It's a matter of what do they know about liberty. The problem is they don't. They do not understand it. Americans have no idea of how unique our system is. The great experiment, as many have called it. Even England doesn't have the system that we have. It is a serious problem that they're changing America before our eyes, and it is done by the American government to the American people. So with that, thank you very much.